Hi, I'm Molinaro, and welcome to the Lead the Future podcast. I'm really excited to have Jeff Desjardins, who is the founder and editor-in-chief of Visual Capitalist. He is the author of two books, Visualizing Change, and his most recent book, Signals, is what we're going to be talking about today. Welcome so much, Jeff, to the Lead the Future podcast. I'm really excited to spend some time talking to you.
Thank you so much. Well, thanks for having me, and I'm super happy to be here.
Talk to me a little bit about what your company does in Visual Capitalist. It's a great business, and I'd like certainly my audience to learn more about your work.
Yeah, so Visual Capitalist is basically the culmination that we came up with based on understanding that 65% of people, from a scientific perspective, are actually visual learners. So they're people that, when it comes to listening or reading or what have you, like these things are not as effective for this crowd. So we created a medium. It's a website primarily, but we have books and we have other things that accompany it. But basically, it's a platform that focuses on visual content. So it's infographics, data visualizations, charts, and other visual media that help people understand more about the world.
Your new book, Signals, has just been released. And tell me about kind of what was the impetus to write their second book at this moment in time.
Yeah, so our very first book, which is called Visualizing Change, is a hodgepodge of our best of, if that makes sense. We took all of the best things that we had done to one point and we squeezed them all into one book. And it's a great book and it has some really cool visuals in it, but it doesn't really feel like it's cohesive in a sense. So what we really wanted to do is we wanted to create something that was singular, something that is unified and really has that feel to it, that it's all together. There's just so much data and information out there that it's really hard to understand what is actually truly going on in the background and the actual trends that are driving that change. One of the things is, if you think about how big the universe is, obviously it's pretty big, quite a few stars, trillions and trillions. So the amount of data in terms of bytes, there's actually 40 times more data in terms of bytes than there are stars in the observable universe. So it's an absolutely mind-blowing amount of data. And then you add to that the speed at which it's growing. So it's actually doubling every 2 years, the amount of data in existence. So if you look at it 5-10 years down the line, we're even more overwhelmed than we are today. So how do we deal with that as leaders, right? So Signals is about that. Let's take these massive amounts of data and try and find some way to synthesize it so that leaders, investors, people that are looking towards the future, they can get some sort of a basic understanding of where the world is going and how their business or how their portfolio fits within that mix.
So give me a sense of what is a signal and how can, everyday leaders really do a better job of paying attention to the signals in their world?
Yeah, so a signal to us is distinct from the rest of the noise in that it's something that is data-driven. It's something that is established, so something that's already happening, not necessarily just a projection towards the future. So it has data backing it up already. It's something that has powerful second-order effects. So it has the capability to impact a bunch of different areas of business and life and society. When you think of something like an electric car and the EV revolution that's happening right now, why is that happening? Is it happening just because people like electric cars more? Is it happening because battery prices are dropping? Is it happening because there's all these different reasons you could look at? But really, it gets distilled down to 2 or 3 major trends, things that we cover in the book. Climate pressure is one of them, which is needs no explanation. But the other is the electrification of everything, which is another separate trend that ties into that. And so you look at these sort of base trends, you really get a sense of the undercurrents that are lifting all of business and moving all of business and society in different directions.
One of the key behaviors of a truly accountable leaders is that they are externally focused, right? They are kind of looking and anticipating what's coming. While, sometimes as leaders, we've got to be heads down, delivering on priorities. These leaders differentiate themselves by kind of taking time out to see what's coming so they can better anticipate and pivot and react as necessary. This idea of a signal is really something that is important. So what are the signals we've got to be paying attention to? I just love the idea, because sometimes they can be big things coming at us, I would suspect, but sometimes they can appear in really subtle little things. Did you find that in your own work and research?
Yeah, I think some of them are things that have happened in a short period of time, and so they're easier to recognize. Like one of our chapters is it's focused on consumer trends, and so the rise of meatless meat. So this has only happened in the last few years, right? So it's something that it's like, okay, well, this is a big thing that's going to change how we eat and how people go about thinking about their health and diets and things like that. So that's a really obvious one. But at the same time, another trend that we cover is the falling of interest rates. And this is a trend that's happened over 700 years. So we actually have data that goes back to the 1300s and shows this trend happening all the way till today. And so something like that's interesting because it didn't sneak up on anybody. It didn't. It shouldn't have caught people by surprise. However, it is something that affects everything we do, and we have to recognize that it's there, and we have to recognize what the implications of that are going forward.
Let's dive into. We can't cover all 27 signals, but as you think about most of the leaders that are out there, and maybe let's pick 3 or 4 of the most critical ones that they got to pay attention to. The one I certainly keyed in on was sort of the accelerating forces around technology. And let's dive into that a little bit. I'm curious to see your perspectives on that.
Awesome. So we'll start with accelerating technology, just because I think that's one that most people can understand. This is our signal origin spread. So these are all different things that are leading to the acceleration of technology. So you have things like more knowledge being accumulated, electricity, semiconductors, et cetera. So it basically just shows where this trend comes from. Then we go into the trend itself. So this is simply Moore's law over time. So it's for people that are familiar with it, this might not necessarily blow you away, but you can see that the calculations per second per $1 is speeding up at, and this is a log scale, by the way. So this is happening at, faster than a linear pace. You can see how fast technology has moved over time. And then when we go to this chart, now we're visualizing what actual technological breakthroughs have happened since the year 1400. And you can see we actually have the last 2 decades in this tiny box that gets expanded on the bottom right here. You can see all these massive, crazy things happening, whether it's scientific advancements like graphene or the completion of the Human Genome Project or the implementation of consumer technology like the iPod or iPad. And so these are all things that are just happening over this tiny period of time. And if you look back on this chart, you can see that there was periods of time where barely any advances happened, right? If you look between 1900 and 1920, you had the radio and airplane, but that's about it, right? So it's really interesting to see what's happening in such a small amount of time.
And do you think that pattern is just going to continue at that same clip?
This is part of the reasoning behind signals and the methodology behind how we built the book, which is that these trends have been shown to be true for a very long period of time. And over decades and decades and decades, they've remained true and are projected to continue coming through. So this is part of our criteria for choosing things in the book. And so, we do believe that it's going to continue happening over time. It's actually accelerating. So it's even faster than you think. And human brains are not really designed or wired to understand that kind of exponential change. As far as this signal goes, I think the main takeaway is that technology is not only changing fast, but that rate of change is increasing. And so if you think the last 10 years have been crazy, wait till the next 10 years, right? And the next 10 years after that. So yes, that has big implications for how we lead our companies and how we lead our organizations. So let's pop ahead to corporate longevity, because I think that's really one of the trends that is impacted by this, which is accelerating technology.
Kind of the shelf life of a company has been shrinking as well. So tell us a little bit about what your research is telling us about that dwindling corporate longevity.
Yeah, so this is the main chart and the main implication here, which is basically if you look at the S&P 500, which is obviously the benchmark index for U.S. stocks and sort of the measure of, are you a big public company in the U.S., what you can see here is that if you go back to 1965, the average age of a company on this major index was 33 years old. So That company stayed on the index for 33 years. Maybe they grew and got onto the index, but then maybe they were bought or maybe they ended up falling apart. What's interesting here is that this ebbs and flows over time, but over the coming years, it's projected to drop down all the way to 12 years. So the average company on the S&P 500 is only be around for 12 years on that index. And the implications of this are shown at the bottom here, which at that churn rate, it's expected that half of companies on the S&P 500 that were there in 2018 will no longer be there in 2027.
That's a staggering insight. And is your sense that's sort of a reality we have to accept? I'd be curious in terms of your thoughts on how do leaders kind of reconcile that, what your data is showing, as they're all working hard to drive business continuity, certainly this year, but into the future as well.
Yeah, so there's two sides of it that I see that I think are interesting from a leadership perspective. On the one side, if you are a bigger company, you have to understand that the world is a lot different than it was 34 years ago. And because of the rising rate of technological change and because of a bunch of other factors, there's lower barriers to entrance for building a company and things like that as well. So it's possible for companies to come in and eat your lunch if you're not careful and if you don't understand the long-term trends driving your business and industry. So that's one thing that leaders in large organizations need to know. The one really cool thing about this, though, is that if you are a leader in a smaller company and you aspire to be on the S&P 500, well, guess what? The companies that are on that index are dropping out faster than ever, and there's new companies replacing them that are doing super innovative and interesting things. So for younger companies and leaders that are a part of startups or fast-growing companies, you are not limited by that situation. You're able to keep growing and you could displace some of these big companies, and there is a potentially very bright future ahead for you. Here you see R&D spending as the new driver ahead of advertising. They used to be equal back in the 70s, and now R&D is much, much more important as a portion of companies' expenses. At the same time, you see CEOs are becoming very concerned about skill availability. 55% of global CEOs say that they are not able to innovate effectively. So, this is a leadership problem, right? How do we make sure our people are ready for fast-changing business? And how do we make sure that they have the skills to take on this new fast-moving reality that we're all in?
Yeah, that was a strong theme. In the very first episode, I interviewed Alain Dehaze, who's the CEO of the Adecco Group, and he spoke about the future of work and really talked passionately about the need to invest in reskilling as a significant priority for companies around the world. And that really supports a lot of your research here as well.
Definitely. Well, let's hop up to the geopolitical chapter because there are some interesting trends around trade there as well that will affect leaders, especially in bigger global companies.
Some of the research, I believe from McKinsey, when they surveyed CEOs, what was a bit concerning was how few of them actually pay attention to this signal. And that obviously creates risk. But I'd love to learn more about kind of what research you have uncovered in this area.
Yeah, that's fair. And I think that in past decades, maybe leaders did not have to be as aware of this. But the reality is that we're in a very interconnected world now. And the shifts in between the respective places of countries and economies and things like that do matter now for most companies. And so this first chapter that we have in this section simply deals with changing trade. So it starts just by showing that by certain measures, if you're looking at GDP in PPP terms, China has already passed the US as the world's largest economy. In terms of nominal GDP, that's not the case, but that'll happen very soon. And then you look at who is the larger trading partner by a geographic region. And you can actually see that back in the day, the U.S. was, the primary trading partner with many, many countries in the world. But here you can see that China has since overtaken the U.S. They're actually the largest trading partner of 128 of 190 countries now. And you can see how the trading blocks shake up. So from a leadership perspective, I think what's interesting about this is, as you said earlier, it's the changing external world in which we are making our decisions, right? If you take for granted the U.S. trade dominance and U.S. economic dominance in the way that your company and vision of your company is, that has already flipped, and it's going to continue changing, and you're going to continue to see a very different world in the next 10, 20 years.
That's absolutely fascinating.
This is more of a side note than anything, but China's largest mega projects, they're happening all over the world. And this is a trend that I think some people are aware of, but you have to understand it within the context of this bigger trend of the economic center and gravity of the world shifting. And companies that aren't paying attention to this and they don't understand how they're going to deal with this geopolitical change, there are going to be some of the bigger companies for sure that are at risk of being one of those companies that is dropping off the S&P, right?
Yeah, as you're talking, it almost seems that there's, in terms of the new capabilities, companies, may have a, chief geopolitical officer on board to really devote time and energy to understanding these patterns and the material impact it can have on the success of a company.
Absolutely, right? And again, it's just that external view. You can't only be looking internally within your company and what you're doing. You really have to have a sense of what's happening in the outside world, whether that's technological trends or the way that trade is changing. Actually, speaking of the way that trade is changing, we can go into our globalization chapter, which I think is also interesting. This is showing that global trade as a percentage of GDP is actually capping. And so that's basically a way to describe globalization, right? The higher the amount of global trade as a percentage of GDP, the more trade there is between countries, the more globalization is taking place. And what you see in recent years, over the last 10 years or so, is that this speed has been slowing down. So it used to be growing 2.1 times the rate of GDP, and now it's at about the same rate, about 1.1%. And as you can see in very recent years, it's kind of peaked or at least plateaued. And what's interesting here is that the goods, so physical objects being traded between countries, that is really flatlined, while the amount of information that's being traded between countries is actually increasing rapidly. And so it's almost as if we have to redefine globalization in a sense, but this is really a way to show how things like trade, the very notion of trade and how we've thought about it for many years is actually changing quite a bit. And that's going to dictate how successful companies are in the future.
Yeah, that's a pretty compelling idea, right? Just in terms of rethinking the very nature and foundation of trade, because it's so, it's so foundational to how we've thought about business, right?
We think of ships coming to a harbor and dropping off tons and tons of goods and money going the other way. But in reality, the coming years, it's going to be information that's being swapped over borders. And then also, this leads right into our next chapter, which is Splinternet, which is that information isn't going to freely trade between all borders, right? Certain borders are going to be blocked off and they're going to have their own internet system. So, this is just another trend within this section that is going to shape the coming years and how information spreads around the world.
One of the signals I found fascinating was the research and the work you projected around, sustainable investing. And I know that is so important today. I'd love for you to spend a few minutes talking about what you have found in that work.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is our sustainable investing chapter. And from a financial perspective and from the implications on companies' perspective, I mean, this is one of the more important chapters in the book because it's basically saying that companies like BlackRock and Vanguard and all of these really large asset managers, they're starting to say that we care about ESG and they're starting to back that with their trillions and trillions of dollars of assets. And just as recent as a couple of years ago, about 33% of assets in markets were ESG assets. But coming forward by 2030, so that's just in a decade, it's expected that about 95% of assets will be ESG related. So for people that are not familiar with this is just basically a way of measuring sustainability through looking at environmental and social and governance pillars within the business. And you can see the growth already that's happening. This is a 6-year gap between 2012 and 2018. But you can see that in North America, for example, this is not even a double. This is a quadruple, right? So this is very significant. When it's 95% of assets in 10 years, it's the companies that have not come up with a strategy in this area. Not only not just come up with a strategy, but aren't doing that strategy well. I mean, those companies are going to be positioned to really struggle, at least as far as investors are concerned and markets. And of course, that's going to have ripple effects in other parts of the company too, right? It's not just markets. If you are not engaging with this trend as a leader, your own employees, your other stakeholders, there's going to be pressure coming from other areas too.
Yeah, and it's some of the research I've covered as well around this gets at the heart of really repurposing the role of companies and corporations in our world, where it's beyond earnings per share, quarterly profits. Those things are important, but increasingly, as all the surveys show, we're looking to our companies, we're looking to CEOs and senior leaders to weigh in on critical social issues, to make sure that they actually are paying attention to these issues, and it's being reflected in the investments they make and the kind of businesses they create. And your research really supports and validates a lot of that.
And it's really also interesting to look at the future of it too, right? Where is this trend coming from and what's driving it? And one of the easiest things to point to is younger generations. It hasn't quite happened yet, but you can see that over coming years, it's projected that millennials first in about the mid 2020s, and then soon after Gen Z are going to have the most spending power in coming decades. And these two generations care even more about these issues than those in current generations. And people in current generations care about these issues. So, when this is projected out and you have all of this wealth that's going to be focused in this area and going to be looking for the companies that not only have financial returns, but that also make an impact and that treat people fairly and are sustainable, where they are limiting these sustainability risks going forward, leaders have a lot to digest there and a lot to think about as they are building out their companies.
Yeah, for sure. And this is a rich area of exploration, and I think where companies and leaders can really set themselves apart. I'd be really curious in terms of your perspective of how do leaders prepare themselves and their people for the future, given the all the signals that you've identified in your work.
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think it depends partially on the person and the type of organization, obviously. But I think one thing that everybody has in common is that we're all bombarded by information. There's things that conflict with one another, leave you in a state of information paralysis where you just can't, you almost feel like you can't figure out what's coming next. So to those people, what I would advise is zoom out, look at the most basic and most established trends. You can't really argue against 700 years of falling interest rates. You can't argue against the way that ESG is rising up. If you can have a good understanding of that basis and those foundations, I think making decisions about the future becomes a lot clearer, and you have less conflicting information. You can look at your own business, your own organization within the context of those trends and see which waves you can ride and which things you have to protect against.
And you talked a little bit about millennials and Generation Z. I'd be curious, as we kind of wrap up our conversation, what words of wisdom, and perspectives can you share with them in terms of what they'll need to do to be, the leaders of the future?
It's so hard to get an understanding of where we're at and where things are going. There's so much information. And to lead, you really have to embrace the fact that you're never going to know everything. You're never going to understand the ins and outs of every decision that you make. And so you have to be comfortable with the fact that there's uncertainty, and you have to let that uncertainty help you grow, right? It's obviously a cliche, but if you look at a a pearl, it grows because of irritation, right? It doesn't grow because it's super comfortable. It grows because it has irritation. And so leaders are the same way, right? We have to be in tough situations to be able to grow and lead.
Well, Jeff, I want to thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to join us to talk about the future, the signals that we have to pay attention to, and really with your generosity of time and sharing some of the key insights from a new book. I wish you much success with it, and thank you and your team at Visual Capitalist for really bringing us so much inspiration and information. Thanks so much, Jeff. All the best.
Thanks, Vince. Thanks for having me.